IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. If you've not been following the news, we've had the CEOs of Apple, Google, Facebook and Amazon testify to the American Congress about an inquiry on antitrust. And frankly, it's just been amazing to see this inquiry develop. I've been tracking it for a few weeks now. It's been on my column. And it's just, I predicted last week that it was going to be an exercise in cross-talking. And to some extent, that was it. But a bunch of other things happened as well. And to discuss all of that, I have with me Takshila's expert on competition, Anupam Manur. Say hi, Anupam.
Hello there.
So, Anupam, could you please lay the context a little bit here? How was the hearing? How did it go? And what was this about?
Firstly, I think, so there's obviously a lot of negative comments about the entire hearing. There's a lot of criticism that nothing ultimately was achieved. And it was, of course, chaotic that all four CEOs were testified at the same time, which meant that you couldn't really go deep into any one of the topics or you couldn't hold anyone really accountable. There was also, criticism against a lot of cross-talking, as you rightly mentioned. And each time when, I think there were more questions thrown at the CEOs than answers that would come out of them. And even when in the rare occasion that they wanted to answer, I think they were not allowed to answer because someone else wanted to steal the limelight and throw another question at them. But having said all of that, I'm still extremely happy that this is happening in its own sense. I might not like the kind of hostile environment, of course, but the fact that ultimately, these are, CEOs of four of the probably biggest companies in the world, and they had an aura of inevitability and invincibility, rather, about them, that they couldn't be touched and they couldn't, they were outside of they were like superheroes, right? They were tech superheroes. So, but to hold them at least accountable to start asking these questions, I think is an important phenomena. And I think we've started on some path. I mean, we as in the US Congress has started on some path. And it'll be interesting to see what develops. I mean, of course, this can't be a one-off event. We have to see how these things develop, whether you're really serious about asking those questions or is it that, you already just want to show that you're doing something, or is it that you already have, a solution that you already have and you want to enforce, and this was just a farce hearing. So we don't know any of those things, but we have to wait and watch. But I think it's an interesting development. Just to, as a blanket statement, I think it's an interesting statement.
Yeah, I agree. And when you mentioned that, we had all these four people testifying together, I thought that was a bit of a bad move. I don't know what complications went into this. Maybe they only agreed to testify if everyone else was also testifying. But here, because the companies have such different business models, right? I mean, it's just, these are huge, complex businesses that are fundamentally different from each other. So covering all of that in 6 hours, and all of them have some element of, how big is too big into them. So at this point, having all four of them testify, I thought that was not the best decision, but maybe it was inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can discuss the logistics of it, which is that, could you have done it on different days? Could you have done it sequentially? How could you have done it better, et cetera, et cetera? But I think that is secondary. Now, I know that, one of the things that has again been levied against this entire hearing was that, these are four extremely different companies. I mean, one is, let's just look at it, right? Facebook is essentially a social media site. Amazon is an e-commerce platform. You've got Google, which is a search engine, and then Apple, which basically, apart from, of course, manufacturing your MacBook Airs and MacBooks and, iPads and iPods and whatnot, and iPhones, of course, but also runs the iStore, and that is the important kind of aspect here. Now, yes, they're seemingly extremely different kind of businesses selling and producing very different kinds of products and services, but they do have an element of commonality amongst them. And this is the first thing that I want to speak about, which is that all of them are platforms. Okay, and they actually all follow the platform business model. And if we talk about platforms and what they are, it's essentially that they are intermediaries between two disparate set of users. And what they do is they bring these two disparate set of users together and create value for them, which they probably couldn't have done without the use of the platform. So you can take, a seller on Amazon and a buyer on Amazon. So it could be, think about even the Indian example for it, just to take it up. You could have a small vendor in Uttar Pradesh who's selling a laptop, and you could have a consumer in Bangalore. Now, there's no way that the two could have normally met, right? And that wouldn't have happened. The transaction wouldn't have happened. But Amazon acts as that intermediary between those two and connects them. And they, the seller in UP could be the lowest priced seller, right? And offers amazing, let's say, customer satisfaction and customer service. Now, Amazon essentially connects these two disparate set of users and gives value to both of them, right? So similarly, you can think of, Facebook connecting different set of users, Google connecting essentially websites and users, and so on and so forth. So they're all platforms, right? So that's the underlying kind of the business structure there. Though they might be selling different goods and services, they are actually all following the platform business model. And I think that is very important to remember, because that comes with it a whole set of complications, set of different economics, principles attached to it. And we can discuss very briefly about what the economics of the platform is and how is it different from a normal market structure. But I think that would be slightly digressing from the main point.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned vertical integration in this context, because I think that applies to all of these platforms to some extent. Maybe not for Facebook, but in general, there is some element of vertical integration baked into all of these. And what was funny to me was that every time someone from Congress asked these guys about vertical integration, how they've been preferring their products over the others, they basically said we have a policy not to do that. But there is every chance that policy has been violated, and they're looking into it. So it was essentially just a showcase of how little these CEOs know about their companies, or they pretend to know. So I imagine if this same thing was actually a shareholder call, their tone would have been completely different. Imagine them going to the shareholders and saying that, well, look, we're not as dominant as you think we are.
Yeah.
I thought that was so funny.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And just for the benefit of the, of our listeners, I think we should just very briefly, tell what vertical integration is. Essentially, actually, if you looked at all of the questions that were thrown at the CEOs, mainly it had to deal with this one aspect of platform economics, which is called vertical integration. So what does that mean? Let's take an example again. You have Amazon, which is a platform, right? It basically on this platform, you have sellers who come onto that platform and sell. You have buyers who come onto the platform and buy. And so that's what the platform does. Now, where the complication, I think, sets in is that Amazon is also a seller on its own platform. So in the US and in Europe and so on, it's called Amazon Basics. In India, because we have a rule against that, initially had even, so they took a different route for it. They called it Cloudtail. Similarly for Flipkart, for example, they were also vertically integrated. That is the platform acting as a player as well on the platform, right? So Flipkart, for example, is the platform. Again, buyers and sellers are on the platform, but it also had this thing called WS Retail, which Flipkart owned, and it would sell on that same platform. So now try and imagine that if you have this kind of vertical integration set up, what would be the incentives at play? So if you're Amazon and you have your own, one of your subsidiaries acting as a seller on your platform, will you have an incentive to favor it or not? Will you have a conflict of interest? And I think that is the key issue there. And the nature of the structure of these platforms are as such that you are continuously, that you as in these companies are continuously incentivized to favor their own sellers and their own subsidiaries or their own products as against someone else who's a third party, right? So if I was Amazon, the platform, and I had Amazon, which is the seller, selling, let's say, a book, right? And the same book is also being sold by Seth and Sons, okay? And so...
That's right.
Yeah. So who... As Amazon, the platform, who would you favor, right? You're always incentivized to favor your own if two people are selling the same products. That's just the starting point of the problems, right? When you have vertical integration, essentially there is every scope that this thing called platform neutrality will be violated. So platform neutrality essentially means that the platform doesn't take sides, right? The platform actually just provides an even playing field for all of the buyers and all of the sellers, and it doesn't take sides. And basically the best product, and here best would mean, highest quality, lowest price, best customer satisfaction, etc., whatever that is, the best product actually just wins on its own. And that's supposed to be the pure competition aspect of it, right? That's what everyone wants. However, because you have this thing called vertical integration, where again the platform acts as a seller on its own side, there is every single option and opportunity for that platform neutrality to be violated. There is all kinds of incentives to favor your own things, and this has happened throughout. We know, for example, there are multiple instances when Google and you can take the simple example. Google has, for example, Google Flights. Okay, and there's also, let's say, Make My Trip, which also offers flight options. So if I search cheap flights from Bangalore to Lucknow and or Kanpur, where are you, Rohan? Kanpur, is it?
Yeah, Kanpur.
Yeah, Kanpur. So if I search for a flight Bangalore to Kanpur, and Google has Google Flights, and there is competition as well, Google will always provide its own sellers first. Its own product first, and then push everything else to the second pages and so on. And then there's been at least, 3 big antitrust cases in Europe against Google, each with over $1 billion fines. There's been multiple investigations in US itself on this, violation of platform neutrality and so on. So we can go into each one of these sellers, and I think we should just talk about a little bit about how this platform neutrality is violated. But this is the essential basic idea, right?
Yeah, I'm also glad that you brought up this platform neutrality aspect, because this also is a very good segue into the other bit of what this hearing was about. Because to put some context, Apple came onto this hearing with a little bit of a chip on its shoulder, because it had a very public diss with a developer called Basecamp. No one's saying that the App Store is a neutral place to be. I think anyone from Spotify will tell you that it's not.
Yeah.
But before this hearing, you had this very public diss. And that was because as an app store, Apple charges around 30% of a cut to people who want to sell stuff on their store. And Basecamp essentially just refused to pay that. And Apple then said that, well, because you are not willing to pay this, you will not be allowed to post any updates to your app, which essentially got sorted out because it was so public. Apple had to, I think, back down. But right before the hearing, Apple released a report that I covered in my column. And the idea was that the report kept saying, okay, that all of these charges that we do, well, it's to justify the cost of the App Store. Fair enough, the App Store does a bunch of things. It has a search function, stuff like that. It makes sure that the users get the best possible experience. Sure. And then they went on to say that other platforms also charge the same fee. And they're looking at the Microsoft Store and the Samsung Bixby Store. I don't know who's going to the Samsung Bixby Store, but like they had this. And that sort of just felt like to me they were not addressing the problem, because let's say if the fee was, let's say, 20%, I think the problem would have still persisted. Because if the fee was 5%, the problem would have still persisted. Because the problem is not the rate of the fee, it's just that there is no possible way to avoid the 30% fee itself. The App Store as a platform is so dominant that if you're a developer who wants to reach out to people who have iPhones, which I imagine is a huge segment of the population, it's also a richer segment of the population that is more willing to pay for apps. There is no way you can let go of this toll booth, right? There's no way you can say that this is a market I don't want to enter. And that's essentially what the report wasn't addressing. And also, when they said that the other platforms also charge 30%, can I just say that the App Store was arguably the first of its kind, and they probably got their 30% idea from the App Store itself? This is just a bit nuts to me. So do you want to comment on this, Anupam? As in...
Yeah, you're right, but there's 2 different aspects at play here. Now, App Store charging a commission is kind of understandable. They're still providing a service, and therefore they will charge a commission. Okay, I think we can discuss the numbers and so on, but I think that is, there's no obligation for the App Store to provide anything for free. I mean, Facebook, charges a fee for ads. Essentially, that's the same kind of thing, right? Google also charges for ads. You have different kinds of platforms which will charge for that service that it provides. Because none of these people, by the way, charge the consumers directly, right? I mean, the app is free, then the App Store doesn't charge the consumers for it. It has to make its money from somewhere, and therefore it charges. Yeah. I think that is the lesser of the two problems. But I think what is really interesting, or what I think really complicates the issue, is that Apple itself produces a bunch of apps. That's where the vertical integration and platform neutrality comes into play. Apple itself produces at least, let's say, about 60 or 70 apps, okay? From, of course, music, from mail to pretty much every other app that you can think of, so about 60 to 70 in pretty much every big domain that there is. Now, these apps obviously don't have to pay that 30% commission that everyone else has to pay. Therefore, just in the beginning itself, they have got a massive kind of advantage, right? It's no longer a level playing field. You've already tilted the scales towards your own particular products. Now, that's only one aspect of it. Second, how do you promote these different apps? Now, for example, in the App Store, you can always promote your Apple apps right in the beginning. So if you search, for example, I just go to the App Store and I type in music app, right? I can take a bet that Apple Music will come up first before Spotify will, right? And I think so that is the next way. And if you're not really particular, if you don't really know the difference between the two, if you don't have very strong preferences about which one is a better music player, etc., the chances are you will go for the first one. And this is what Google does. I mean, all Google has to do to completely eliminate all its competition is to push the search results of its competitors to the second page, right? In fact, you can bury complete dead bones and bodies on the second page of Google app, on Google search, and no one will find it, right? That's the power of the search engine. So similarly, I think in the App Store, that's what it does. Amazon does this. Since Amazon controls the platform itself, it will, the buy box, which is that essential, the biggest real estate on the e-commerce website, always you'll find Amazon's own products. And so it does a bunch of really naughty stuff, both Amazon, Apple, Google, all of these players. And so that's the second bit. Third, I think, and this again, we can go back to history, is that because Spotify was such a big challenger to Apple Music, and when Apple Music was just kind of launched and they wanted to really make it big, they deliberately charged Spotify a much higher commission fee than it did for others, right? So it can just suddenly tilt the scales in whichever direction it wants, because it's a platform and it's a gatekeeper. So this gatekeeper function is essential, it's very important, right? And we've seen, it's not just, these are the four big ones, of course, but you can see how this gatekeeper functions with Booking.com. Or you can think about, even in the Indian context, by the way, there is a competition commission inquiry about exactly the same thing, which is about, Make My Trip and OYO, etc. And both of them are under investigation by the Competition Commission of India. So I think these are very essential things that you got to talk about and think about, that platform neutrality aspect again. So this is just, again, one part of it. That is the platform favoring its own product over others, and thereby ruining the others' chances of competing fairly in that marketplace. But there's one other thing that, Amazon especially is guilty of, and this is that it uses, and this is the main kind of allegation against Amazon, is that Amazon uses the controversial, it's extremely controversial, but it uses the data from third-party sellers on its own platforms to inform the development and promotion of its own products, right? So what it does is essentially, it lets the platform essentially, is a lab, right? So there are multiple third-party sellers. All you do is just keep collecting data, and this is, by the way, illegal, because they actually, as you correctly mentioned, they have a policy against this, but of course it's observed more in the breach. So they essentially collect data from all of its sellers. You see which kind of sellers are doing well, what are its promotion policies, what kind of products are doing well, what is the price points at which people are buying, what is the general trends and etc., trends and preferences of the consumers, and so on. And then basically Amazon Basics, which is just its own subsidiary, will produce those same products probably at a lower price and then promote it on its platform, right? And Amazon has been doing this for multiple times. There are multiple studies which have shown this. And the funny thing, as you correctly mentioned, Rohan, is that when Bezos was asked this question, he did highlight that there is a company's policy banning this particular practice, but actually said, and I quote, "I can't guarantee you that this policy has never been violated." So that is really funny. As you correctly said, it's the CEO who's saying that we have a policy, but we can never be sure that it's being followed, and that basically amounts to not right.
Yeah, the interesting thing also to me was that. So basically, they tell the guy that this is the instance where we've seen that this policy has not been followed. So he's acknowledged that the policy has been followed. They give him an example of where the policy hasn't been followed. It's a really sad story of a bookseller who's doing really well, and then Amazon decides to basically take the market share, whatever. And Bezos basically says, well, this should not have happened.
Yeah.
And then he says that we'll try to correct this, which basically amounts to, okay, we'll try to do something about it. This means no large-scale change, and generally this is against whatever we stand for. Which to me it just feels like the wrong thing to say, because there's no potential solution being discussed here, apart from the fact that this one bookseller might, be reimbursed for whatever damage Amazon did to them. Because surely millions of such instances exist, or at least thousands. I don't have an exact number on this because as I don't have Amazon's data. But no solution was talked about here. Instead, it just became very apparent that this is a problem, and the guys basically admitted that. And to me, that was very damning. I think that this is going to be a major play going forward, especially for Amazon.
Yeah, you see, you're absolutely right on that. I think there's no way to fix this apart from actually fixing the entire incentive structures at play, and how do you ensure platform neutrality? You can't take one case, as you said, and say, okay, we're going to reimburse. That's not going to solve anything. But you have to go back, in time to even the Microsoft solution, for example, right? When you're talking about structural solutions, you need structural solutions. So the Microsoft case, which was the first such case of vertical integration and violation of platform neutrality in 1998, spoke exactly about this particular thing, where Microsoft was seen to unfairly favor Internet Explorer over, let's say, Netscape and Opera and whatever other browsers that were in vogue at that point of time. And they were found guilty, and they essentially, the structural solution back then was that Microsoft decided to, form this particular committee of experts, which both of them agreed, etc. And they basically, they showed their proprietary code, and they agreed to reveal their proprietary code and ensure that this, the platform neutrality was not going to be violated in the future. So they agreed, it was more of self-regulation as such. And the biggest kind of threat that they had was that, these guys were actually going to look at the code. So, and then, if they found anything to be, again, violating those principles, then they would be taken into much higher kind of thing. So what the solution back then was that they didn't put a fine, they didn't, try to break it up immediately. But what they tried to do was saying that it's in your own interest to actually follow these bunch of things, and Microsoft agreed, and I think that was a very good solution. So that's one of the solutions that we have to speak about. But I think there's multiple other solutions that we have to discuss as well, right? And these are, again, structural solutions. You can't take one particular aspect or one example and say we're going to fix that one, because as long as the incentives for the platforms are the same, then they're always going to, as I said, favor their own products over others, over their competitors. So what are the other things they can do? One is, there's a very simple kind of non-discrimination clause which you can put in law and say that, as legally you cannot discriminate one seller against the other. Now, I know this is probably simplistic. You're, again, ensuring or hoping for a lot of state capacity to detect platform neutrality, and they're not able to do that really, and then follow through on whatever the legal means are. But it's just, I'm saying, one of the solutions, again, that you can do. The second thing, and I think with platforms this becomes increasingly important, is that, when you talk about this consumer welfare standard, which is the prevalent kind of standard for competition, that is that business will only be investigated by the relevant authority if it does harm to consumers, right? So dominance by itself is not wrong, but abuse of dominance is wrong. And how do you prove that abuse of dominance? It is when consumers are harmed. Now, Facebook, Amazon, Flipkart or Google, etc. will all say that how am I harming the consumers? I'm actually giving them all of my products for free. Facebook is free. Google search is free. Amazon, by the way, you just pay for the product. You don't, as a consumer, you don't pay to Amazon directly, for that search function, etc. App Store, you don't pay anything, etc. Right? So all of them will say that, we are providing a service for free and therefore we're not really harming consumers at all. Right? So then that is why prima facie, by the way, in India, you cannot launch an investigation against some of these companies, right? So one simple solution here is to actually look at both sides of the platforms as consumers. Right? Now, if you're a seller on Amazon, then you're actually a consumer of Amazon, right? You're actually buying a service from Amazon, which is the listing service, right? You want to be listed on the platform. So you're actually nothing but a consumer as well. Now, you might be selling to the buyer directly or through the platform, but you're actually a consumer of Amazon. So then if you just broaden this particular scope of what you call as consumers, then I think, and you apply the same principles of consumer welfare, that by itself can solve a lot of the problem, right? So that's the second solution to really think about this. And by the way, these are not mutually exclusive. Some of them can be overlapping, etc. But the other kind of solution is to think about, business arbitrator. Here, by the way, the big question is about competition, right? How competitors on some of these platforms get harmed. It could be, the sellers on Amazon, or it could be the app makers on iStore, etc. So the other one is, if you want to still treat them as, businesses as against treating them as consumers, then like you have a consumer court, why not have a business arbitrator, for example, right? So you can have a specialized kind of court system, and you can think about different countries will have different kind of solutions. It can be housed within the Competition Commission, for example, and then, you can basically arbitrate between two businesses who are having trouble. So a seller can basically go to one of these business arbitrators and say that, listen, I'm getting hurt because of Amazon, right? Because Amazon is violating platform neutrality. So there are different conditions that you can look into that, they can basically prove that I'm offering a very similar service as Amazon Basics, for example, at the same kind of price range. And despite that, or probably at a lower price, but despite that, I'm getting, pushed to the second page of the search results, or I'm not getting this thing on the platform, right? So you can prove that, and then you can take action against the particular thing. So these are, some ways that you can think about structural. Again, these are just, random kind of solutions, and we can definitely refine them and make them better. But this is the idea that there are solutions out there which are workable, which can actually solve a large part of the problem, and crucially, without really hurting or destroying the kind of welfare and the kind of consumer surplus that some of these platforms give us, right? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. All said and done, Facebook is beneficial to consumers. Google is, of course, massively, Google and all of its properties are massively beneficial to consumers. So is Amazon, and so is, other kind of business, these big tech, as we call them. So breaking up big tech is not really the solution. I mean, in fact, that when you try and break up big tech, it is completely impossible to do so, by the way. I mean, it just cannot be done. And two, even if you try to do it, you will end up destroying both the business and destroying all of the consumer surplus that's there. So that is like, literally taking a hammer to a very nuanced surgery, right? You can't do it that way. You need more nuanced tools. You need sophisticated tools. You need a scalpel instead of, a hammer, right? So that's the kind of idea here.
All right. I think that's very informative. One thing I want to add here is also that there is a lot of great research on this topic, and someone that I've been following recently and would like to recommend to our listeners is Professor Tim Wu. He's a columnist at New York Times, and also is a professor at Columbia University, if I'm not wrong. And he's written a great book about this. It's called The Master Switch, and there's another one that's called The Curse of Bigness. And the Master Switch, he basically talks about how AT&T avoided antitrust for tens of years, which was by just working with the regulators. And that's something that he predicts in a podcast recently that Facebook might also end up doing. So a lot of ways this thing can go, as Anupam has explained. So I think this makes for a lot of great reading. Thank you so much, Anupam, for joining in, for contributing to this. And we'll link our Twitter handles as well as the books in the show notes. So yeah, have a nice day. Thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. Some really fun guests on the network this week. Cyrus welcomed Dia Mirza to come and have a conversation about all kinds of different things. Danny Morrison was on Edges and Sledges, the cricket podcast. If you haven't heard that, that's always a fun listen. And Rahul Subramanian was on Football Should Fall to grow their ever more exciting list of guests. And it's not just that. Mantra Mugdha, an old friend of ours, was on Advertising is Dead. Manu Pillai was on the Filter Coffee podcast. It's been one great guest after the other. And with that, we hope to catch you again next week.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.